Okay, we are now recording, so welcome everyone to our weekly call. Let me just share my slides. So this week we'll be talking about the IETF 126 meeting in Vienna last week. Before we do that, let me, so I don't forget later, thank our sponsors, DNS for supporting the call. Much appreciated. Yeah, so the plan for the call, we'll talk a little bit about the IETF 126 meeting. I'll sort of share my thoughts. Anyone else that was there can chime in with theirs as we go along. And then there's been a slew of interesting things from the last week. So we talk about some of those, as well as forthcoming events, topics for future calls, etc. So the challenge for everybody else on the call is to interject every so often, otherwise you'll literally hear me talking at you for the entirety of the call, and no one wants that, least of all me. Okay, so just a reminder, IETF 126 meeting. It was the first time the IETF has been in Vienna since IETF 113, I think it was, which was the first in-person meeting immediately after COVID. So when we went to the Hilton Vienna Park for that meeting, there were somewhere between 300 and 350 of us present on site. As opposed to this time, as you'll see in the slide, 1,236 people on site, apparently. So quite a big difference, roughly 900 more people present on site. And in total, nearly 2,000 people registered for the meeting. So quite a bumper meeting of recent years. And a fair uplift on the last meeting, actually, in Shenzhen. So just under 2,000 versus just over 1,500. So yeah, good to see plenty of people and not just inside meetings. So what I'm going to do is walk through and share my comments from each of the days. I'm just going to give comments on probably average about three sessions a day, and I will not be offended if anyone wants to chime in with anything else that hit you on the day in question, or indeed comments on the things that I've commented upon. Either of those things will be totally fine. And I can see, actually, Vicky's commented on something in the chat, which I think refers to one of the things in the weekly news. So we'll get on to that in a moment or two. Okay, so kicking off the week proper, last Monday, we had sort of PARSEP. We had the dispatch session, which, amongst other things, we put forward our proposal on a network protocol for parental controls for dispatch. I think we managed to get two separate outcomes from the chairs during the meeting for that proposal, which is quite impressive, which was, I think, as I recall, either dispatched initially to a mailing list or just sort of not dispatched for ongoing work. So I need to check back with them to confirm what their sort of official conclusion was, because it can't be both of those simultaneously. But it was notable, using that session as an example, that certainly compared even to the Shenzhen meeting, that the meeting rooms were substantially fuller than they have been of late. Some of them were effectively standing room only, which, to be honest, was, in a funny sort of way, was good to see the level of interest in the rooms, in the sessions on the main agenda. It was partly a function of it's a slightly smaller than average venue for IETF meetings, but nevertheless, it was good to see it wasn't just side meetings that were attracting a lot of interest. So other things from the Monday, I went to the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group, HRPC. Quite an interesting presentation from Dr. Corinne Kath, who some of you will know, an academic formerly of Cambridge University, currently with Article 19, the Civil Society Group. And she was talking about the movement of the .nl domain name by SIDN onto AWS, or more accurately, the administration of the .nl domain name onto AWS. So just talking about the symbolism of that versus sort of digital sovereignty, and the conversation that kicked off in the Dutch Parliament when it became known that that was planned, and some of the governance and other issues that surfaced in that discussion. It wasn't specifically aimed at AWS, but sort of hyperscalers in general, AWS being the example that happened to be sort of the pertinent for this particular one. So it's quite an interesting discussion. To be honest, it didn't really feel like it belonged in HRPC. It was probably more pertinent to the decentralization of the Internet Research Group, but the difference, this particular meeting will be academic, pun intended, not least of which because the DNRG session was cancelled, so it didn't actually matter. It was probably in the wrong session. It was an interesting presentation around some of the issues raised by the hyperscalers, the ongoing consolidation of stuff, and etc., etc. Also, and very definitely in the right place, Tim Engelhardt from the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner, which is a bit of a mouthful, gave a presentation just talking around sort of human rights implications of digital technologies. Obviously, and sort of talked about the sort of international human rights law, etc., etc. So that felt like that was in the very much the right place. So on topic for that particular research group. But the other one I mentioned, but I find it impossible to summarize meaningfully. DNS Ops had the first of two sessions, the second one taking place on Friday. So I had sort of bookending the week, Monday and Friday, with an impossibly long series of set of agenda items for both meetings. And despite that, the chairs managed to get through all of them and finish, I think it was a few minutes ahead of time. So to illustrate that, they had presentations on 3 existing working group documents, 3 potential new work items, and 5 items on new ideas. So which is quite a lot for one 2-hour meeting. The 5 brief presentations were interesting in a sense because that seemed to be, well, it was a sort of a DNS dispatch session, which is interesting in of itself, given that DNS isn't an area per se within the IETF setup. So I didn't know that regular working groups could dispatch stuff. So yeah, I'm not sure the background to that particular idea, but it was interesting to see. I guess anyone can express their opinions on where something might fit within the IETF structure, but I don't know if their decisions such that they would be binding. Yeah, as I say, overall, an immense amount of material was covered within the available time. So hats off to the chairs. It's a sort of probably a good casebook example of time management and just getting stuff done. So well done to them.
For which there were enough counter examples elsewhere, weren't there, Andrew, for
Yes, there were any counterexamples elsewhere. That is entirely fair to say, Tom. Yes, indeed. So, yeah, I think everyone should look to the DNS ops chairs for that. But let me just pause there in case anyone wants to jump in with any comments on any of that, or indeed anything else from Monday. Then I'll move on to Tuesday.
Probably worth highlighting that Parsep in Dispatch accreted the usual comments, which most of them amounted to, I don't like parental controls, so I'm not going to engage with this in a constructive manner. Which luckily is like water off a duck's back to some of us. But we're getting there, I think, with people starting to see that, thanks to social media bans and all sorts of sort of blunt instruments coming along, that this is a thing that happens on the internet, and either make it happen in a good way or watch it happen in a bad way, I guess, is your choice.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a very fair comment, Tom. Topical as well. I forgot to put it in the news headlines, but I think President Macron got agreement to bring in a social media ban in France for the children aged 15 and under. So that is an area which seems to be gaining momentum. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on to Tuesday. Apologies for this smaller text. I'll summarize my comments from this. Again, I just pulled out, I think, 3 sessions from here. The IAB's open meeting included a guest presentation from Louise Beltzung, titled Safe, Private and Free, Pick 2, which given actually a good segue, Tom, thank you. Good segue in terms of that was about sort of protection of children online. And again, she sort of talked to that topic around some of the imperfections perhaps of using things like social media bans and the shortcomings of that. I thought Vittorio, who many of us will know from Open Exchange, made a very good point from the microphone. So almost echoing what Tom just said, in a sense that there's a lot of demand for the protection of children, at least in Europe. And yeah, does the IETF community want to watch and see what's happening, or get involved and find better ways of doing it, rather than perhaps holding our hands up in horror at silly things that others are doing? I'm slightly paraphrasing what he said, but he said it actually much more eloquently than that, but I thought there was a point well made, and quite timely.
And poor old Louise did take something of a battering, particularly in the chat, which rarely actually comes up at the meetings. It's like, look, some people stand up at the microphone, others tap away. There's lots of open laptops, aren't there, Andrew?
Yeah, true.
And others just tapping away into the chat. And I kind of hope Louise never got to read some of that. I suspect she didn't get to read some of that, but I thought some of it was a little bit on the unpleasant side.
Yes, I doubt any guest presenter, well, I think it's highly unlikely any guest presenter is likely to look at the chat afterwards, which of course makes your witty, pithy comments in the chat totally pointless, at least from the point of view of the presenter, as opposed to going to the mic like Vittorio did. But yeah, fair to say that the chat, I'm sure that many of you will be aware, go to IETF meetings, can be quite lively, not always constructive, and certainly not always on topic with the matter in hand. That can be quite humorous at times. Okay, then for me, the first time AI, well, actually, it's not true. The AI also arose in some of the dispatch sessions, but certainly came up in the next one. The discovery of agents, workloads, and named entities, or Dawn, that took place, and was really, as a BOF, was looking at whether work should kick off within the IETF, looking at agentic AI, particularly around, as the name quite explicitly says, sort of identity of agents, potentially also with trust, with sort of workload type issues, but mainly about identity discovery, etc. It was a very full room. This was definitely one which was standing room only in the main room. I believe there was also an overflow room used, which was also, I saw from comments afterwards, standing room only. So over 300 people were on in Meet Echo. And given any meeting I've noticed, certainly not everyone that's in the room is on Meet Echo, even though the chairs will overtly ask people to do so. So yeah, a substantial number of people took part in that discussion. It was quite interesting. I mean, somebody did ask whether the IETF was in a position to move fast enough. In an unintentionally ironic way, I think the next person at the mic suggested the first thing we ought to do is to form a research group in the IETF to do a literature review before deciding what to do next, which, as I say, was unintentionally ironic given the comment about whether we can move fast enough or not. Doing a literature review didn't seem to be the obvious way to show we can indeed move fast enough. It wasn't immediately obvious what conclusion you could draw from it. I spoke to Adrian, one of the co-chairs, afterwards, because I thought the co-chairs did a good job of steering the conversation and getting us through the material. But I genuinely don't know whether there will indeed be a work group forming. I hope so, because there is work happening in this area, and so it seems entirely sensible to do it, and potentially to leverage, I think, DNS as the obvious namespace that would help with the naming and discovery of agents. Although bizarrely, suggesting that the DNS might be a useful starting point seemed to be quite controversial to some in an IETF meeting, which as I say, felt bizarre, given it's the most obvious tool that the IETF has in its toolkit. But there you are. So gut feel, even though it wasn't obvious from the discussion, probably this will lead to a working group, will be my gut feel from that. But interesting to see what others think. But before you share your thoughts, the other one I just mentioned, PEARG, Privacy Enhancements and Assessments Research Group, or PEARG, as Sarah calls it. Had two fantastic presentations. Firstly, Johnny Ryan from Enforce, which is an Irish consumer group, gave a presentation. He's sort of talking about advertising, digital advertising, I should say, and how it interacts with or impacts on our privacy. He uses a case study of an ad at the top of a page on an Irish newspaper, and what happens when that page is served to your screen, and how that goes out to auction to potential advertisers that want to direct to you, and what sort of information is disclosed to those advertisers. Essentially, it completely trashes GDPR. And that's not a theoretical position to adopt, because rather helpfully, one of the big agencies involved in this, bizarrely, wrote to the European Commission asking for a derogation from GDPR because they couldn't comply with it, which seemed to be rather helpful, that they were putting their hands up. They would in fact be breaking the law, and sending that in writing to the people responsible for the law. Bizarrely, that didn't seem to automatically trigger enforcement action, but I believe from what Johnny said that his organisation has in fact initiated calls to action against at least one of the major participants in the marketplace as a sort of a test case. What was also interesting, Johnny was followed by Simon Lerman, who I think is an academic, who was presenting some research findings about how you can use LLMs to de-anonymize stuff. It gave, again, a fairly simple case study where you just conduct a short interview with anonymized participants. You imagine it could be the scenario of a job interview, and within less than 10 minutes of conversation, you could quite easily, or with a high degree of accuracy, work out who they were without asking them who they were, but just from the answers to a series of questions, would narrow down quite quickly who they probably were. And that was from a very limited number of data points. And obviously, it gave some examples of how you could then de-anonymize anonymous social media accounts, for example, which could be quite problematic depending on where in the world you lived and the regime in which you, the jurisdiction in which you lived. And clearly, if you took the fire hose of data points that Johnny Ryan's presentation could serve up from advertising, it will be trivial, I think, to de-anonymize people because it had a vast number of data points. So yeah, between those two discussions, it's quite alarming. So really helpful, and as I said to the coaches at the time, I think superbly well curated by them to put those two back to back to really sort of identify the problem and potentially, in my view, entirely justifiable to sort of author an update to or the second volume of RFC 7258, Pervasive Monitoring is an Attack, which was written immediately after the Snowden revelations. I think it'd be entirely justified to write a sort of a companion to that, but essentially sort of underlining how it's actually the tech companies that are the problem, and they make the sort of the law enforcement agencies, governments look like amateurs when it comes to privacy violations. But whether that will ever be said at an IETF meeting, who knows? I suspect probably not.
And Andrew, if I can just chip in that we're quite interested in seeing if there's an appetite for a workshop on threats from both AI and advertising to anonymity, which we think would be the sort of seeding ground for a potential companion document if that were to emerge on those ground, and take those two as the conceptual threats that would feed into that. So we're hoping to move forward on that. So thanks for mentioning this.
Oh, fantastic. What venue would you envisage for the workshop out of interest, Sarah?
So yeah, we're still looking at that. We might reach out to the IAB and see if there's any interest from them on this. Otherwise, we would probably do it as a standalone interim workshop just for the research group.
Right.
Yeah, that would be it. Or potentially a side meeting, but I think in the first instance, an interim is where we would start.
Certainly an IAB sponsored workshop would be ideal, in my view, if they were up for that, a bit like they did for age verification last August.
Yeah.
Something along similar lines which had about 30 or so participants from memory. So it was sort of quite a focused discussion, but with good facilitation to sort of properly explore the subject matter, but without 100 people throwing rocks at you from the sidelines, which would probably be quite helpful. I
think our feeling at the moment is we need to scope the problem a little bit before we take it to that scale, but it's certainly something we'd like to work on.
Yeah, excellent. Right, well, that will be interesting to see if that takes place. Hopefully it will. Anyone else with any observations from Tuesday? If you can remember that far back. And if not, I will plow into Wednesday. Again, with just a couple I'm going to talk to. So on Wednesday, we had the general area dispatch, not to be confused with the other dispatch session, which happened on Monday. So general area dispatch is for the general area, which tends to be more process orientated documents or proposals, work matters. As a reminder, the sort of general area at the moment, at least, is the area director is the ISG chair, So Roman at the moment, but Lars previously. So it seems to come with the territory as being IETF or ISG chair rather. In contrast to the dispatch session on the Monday, they only had two documents to consider, so a rather longer discussion on each of them. First of which was really looking into the issue of participants not attaching legal terms on their submissions to the IETF, including just posts to mailing lists. I think triggered by a series of posts from Daniel Bernstein, I think it is, cryptographer to the TLS working group, and then latterly to the IETF mailing list. So anyway, they worked through the proposal and are certainly, I think, accepted that needs to continue. So dispatched to the general area group, but that any wording that goes into the document will need to be reviewed by IETF's legal counsel before it's finalised, just to make sure that it is correct. And then the second paper, slightly pompous title in my view, the composition and comportment of the IETF nominating committee, which triggered a lot of debate, mainly on the content of the document rather than the dispatch decision, which is a bit frustrating. But in essence, I think the intent is good, which is to try and improve the sort of gender balance of the IETF community, which any of you that have been to meetings in person is not great. I mean, it's better than it was. It's still not great, but it was so low that anything is like to be better than that. Anyway, it had two proposals within the document which probably need to be separated. One of which is to have a minimum specification on the gender balance of the non-com itself. So as a reminder, that's appointed through random selection. The idea is that you, yes, you do it through random selection, but you look for a minimum of two. I was going to say women, that's not correct. Two members of the non-dominant gender, or two members who are not from the dominant gender. So women and potentially others. And then separately, so that's the composition part. The comportment part is how it conducts itself to avoid discrimination intentionally or otherwise, essentially by saying it should have standardized questions, which it does anyway. So I'm not sure that would achieve a great deal. I think a previous version of the draft suggested that you couldn't have any variation from the standardized questions, including additions or follow-ups. I think the text currently has been softened from that, but as I say, it is doing that anyway. So I'm not sure that the draft will make huge detail there. As I say, there's a lot of discussion which was really off topic, looking at the specifics of the document rather than whether it should be continued with. We also
and with regard to that one, Andrew, I would have said that's basically that is the only competition for Parsep. I think it probably beats it in terms of proposal that got the most off-topic, pointless, pettifoggery, snark, and general. I'm trying to pick holes in this just because I don't like it. From the IETF. Again, like Mallory and I don't often come down on the same side of things because she's one of the crew who'd rather like privacy trump safety every time. But I thought again, this was just one of those where you could feel it in the air that there was a good chunk of people who didn't want this to go anywhere, and they were going to do their damnedest to make sure of that, which is a damn shame.
Yeah, as I say, personal view, I think if it was separated into two documents, that would, I'd be surprised if the first half, the composition element, didn't go through much more easily that way, but I could be wrong. who knows? The plenary went swimmingly until we got, I think it was the ISG questions, when suddenly we had lots of questions. So it looked like we'd be finished within an hour, when in reality we finished pretty much on the dot, 2 hours. There are plenty of questions around whether we should go to Kuala Lumpur, with some concerns raised, some in the chat, sorry, some on the microphone, a lot more in the chat, around whether you're allowed to go to Kuala Lumpur if you're Jewish. I think there might be, apparently from the chat, there's a law against being allowed to be there if you're Jewish. As I say, that was in the chat. I've not fact checked that. And also if you're LGBTQ, whether that poses any issues. So some concerns that were voiced about that. Jay, the ISG, sorry, the IETF sort of director, so who runs the secretariat, I think handled that quite well and pointed out that a lot of people struggle to go to different venues. Going somewhere doesn't endorse any particular jurisdiction, but the idea is by going to a variety of places, it sort of, I think the phrase you use, it sort of spreads the pain around somewhat. He said it much more eloquently than that. It seemed fair in my view. There were also comments on Mike about poor behaviour in the TLS working group mailing list. Some discussion about lack of diversity in the community and its leadership. And then a fair amount of discussion about AI also came up, and the impact on standards bodies in different ways, as well as whether SDOs can remain relevant if they don't embrace the topic. Noting the challenges that AI poses, which we'll come on to imminently. So yeah, I thought some quite good points were raised at the mic this time around. It wasn't just people venting, but there's probably about an hour's worth of mic stuff and about an hour's worth of presentations from the various leadership teams.
It would probably be a little self-serving for anyone to say that their comment on the mic got a round of applause from the room. So I'll say it for you, Andrew. Your comment on the mic got a round of applause from the room. So well done. Which Andrew's comment was largely about people ought to be more well-behaved in various forums. Yeah, received a round of applause. And I think the plenary altogether, a disappointing amount of need for the popcorn.
Actually, yes, we did literally have popcorn. I don't know if that was an ironic comment, sort of comment on the whole thing, but and I don't even know if it was asked for, or if it was just something that was provided by the venue by chance. But it was mildly amusing to see that boxes of popcorn were available to take into the discussion, which seemed entirely sensible in many ways. I have to say, in fairness, overall, compared to some recent plenaries, it was reasonably well behaved, reasonably positive in tone overall, was my takeout. Certainly there'd been more negative discussions at the mic line in previous sessions. And thanks for the comment about the applause. I'd forgotten about that. It completely slipped my mind. Yes, we need better behaved people in the TLS working group, and the co-chairs and the AD have got the patience of a saint. I have no idea why they keep turning up, as I said at the mic, but there you are. Anyway, moving on. Let's look at Thursday. This was probably, along with PARG, one of these sessions was my other highlight from the week. So, TLS working group first of two sessions took place on Thursday morning, and they kicked off with the chairs. So they had a monologue, they literally called it that, and they walked through what they propose to do differently to get the buy-in from the group that those, in fact, the things they would do differently would be broadly acceptable. The intent being to get buy-in before they did more enforcement, etc., which they duly got. Of course, rather unfortunately, and they did a lot of polls of the attendees, those both in the room and online, against each of the things they were proposing to do to just test the level of buy-in. One of the slides talked about that they'd be more draconian in their enforcement on the mailing lists. Someone in the room queried the use of the word draconian, and they softened it a bit. Sean, I think it was, said he'd done the wording of the polls late the night before and was a bit tired, and perhaps he should have used them. More maybe assertive would have been perhaps a better word than draconian, something like that. Anyway, it was fine. But then, literally about half an hour after the meeting finished, bear in mind, everyone sheepishly agreed that they would be better. In the mailing list, someone who hadn't been in the room or online in real time had seen the wording, looked it up in a dictionary, and it basically means something like, it suggests they were going to be over enforcing or something like that, authoritarian, those sorts of connotations, and that was awful. That triggered some replies from people that had been in the room, apparently triggered some private replies to the person off the mailing list. So basically, within an hour of the meeting taking place, the behaviour of some on the TLS working group have already slipped back into their old bad habits. So that was quite impressive that they did that in less than an hour after agreeing that they'd do better. Later on in the day, I went to the Procon working group, mainly as I put the slide, because I believe that we shouldn't just assume that somebody else would take care of process issues in how the IETF works, and they were doing some nitty-gritty process things. I won't bore you with the details. It wasn't especially exciting. There was one unfortunate comment which was intended not to be picked up by the mic, which was, so there was an apology on the mic from something. But then that led into the RASP research group, Research and Analysis of Standard Setting Processes research group. It sounds deeply uninteresting, but was exceptionally interesting. Principally two presentations. So there was other content in the group. I've only picked out the two standout ones. Firstly, Mark Nottingham, who many, if you've been involved in IETF at all, will know. He works for Cloudflare. Really interesting presentation. It was sort of talking about how AI can be both a helpful tool if you want to engage in standards bodies like the IETF, and also can be a problem. Some of the positive uses she uses, if, for example, English isn't your first language, it can be really helpful in helping you to sort of sharpen the language in perhaps your draft, or to understand what's going in a working group, what the key issues are, or how it might react to a draft, that sort of thing. But also on the downside, it can, because it really has sort of removed the barriers of participation in terms of it's trivially easy to create a draft, so you can flood the system with drafts. They may contain nonsense, but it takes time to review them. So it's like a denial of service attack. You can use tools, agentic AI tools, to produce lengthy replies to short messages on mailing lists. Again, bit like a denial of service attack, etc. So he also, after that, he also demonstrated a tool that he's been developing that's been sort of trained on the IETF content, and it can indeed do things like summarize recent activity in a given working group, offer an opinion on a current draft, suggest how a group might respond to a draft before you submit it, so you can fine-tune it, etc. So it was really an interesting tool. And I think, Tom, yes, I think that's the one you've just put the link to in the chat, Tom. Thank you. And then Jamie or Jaime Jimenez of Ericsson sort of followed on with that. Again, well curated, a bit like the PARG sort of speakers, with a tool that could help determine whether a draft had been written by AI or by a human. It's quite easy to use. You can just put a link to a draft and it will tell you. I think it looked at, I think it was 5 different tools like Claude and others, each gave a score, and it sort of took all of the scores together and then told you whether overall it was probably human or probably AI. You could also use it to look at a working group as a whole and get a sense of if it was mainly so submissions were mainly from AI or from human authors, so either individual draft or group of drafts effectively. So I think those 2 back-to-back were really interesting. And you'll see from my comment in the bottom of the slide, I think I said this on the mic. I think a lot of the rules of participation in standards bodies were written, some decades ago in the main, with an assumed participation in good faith by all participants, even if they might not see eye to eye. And I suspect you really need to rewrite them from the ground up, because you can't assume good faith participation when you've got tools which make it easy to launch attacks on a group, either at the mailing list level or with documents and so on. So we need to reconsider how the mechanics of the groups work, probably. And that would be my view. Again, I will stop there and see if anyone wants to comment, either on those or anything else from Thursday.
Well, you were taking a bullet for us in ProCon, Andrew. I went to the IRTF, which was indeed very interesting. The agenda had 3 talks on it. First, on formalizing dependence of web infrastructure. A young lady from Stanford University talking about how hosting DNS and CA infrastructure was becoming kind of homogenized, and showing which countries had the most sort of groupings of these, and there are only really 7 places where certificate authority is coming from, so lots of people are using naturally a CA that is outside of their country, and some particular countries quite interestingly had high concentrations of very local hosting providers, but whereas most were smattered around the big 3. So like nothing really surprising, but still quite an interesting piece of research worth looking up and just having a look through her numbers, because they're vaguely interesting. And then fingerprinting deep packet inspection devices by a chap called Diwen Xu from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, basically looking at middle boxes, which of course is a subject matter of mine that I enjoy, and trying to work out what products were in use based on things that they do, such as refragmenting packets and defragmenting packets and rebuilding packets in weird ways. That's kind of indicates that there might be, say, a FortiGate system or a Cisco system or whatever it is, whoever's brand it is, have little inconsistencies and ambiguities. And he was able to fingerprint some of these, which is extremely interesting. And I offered him some help should I be able to provide it in looking at other systems. And then there was a 3rd talk on discussion of internet working challenges for AI, which must have been absolutely stultifyingly boring because I can't remember a jot of what happened.
So it's a good test about if you can't remember anything about it within a few days, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and the consumption of beer was remarkably limited throughout, largely limited by Vienna, really. Like, they don't seem big ones, or at least in that area, for bars where you can just walk in and go, "Can I have a beer, please?" Like, would you mind sitting down first, and then can you wait 3/4 of an hour for someone to come with a menu, and then choose a beer, and then wait another 3/4 of an hour for the beer to arrive? Anyway, that's my only complaint about Vienna. Otherwise, a lovely place full of lovely people who speak very much better English than my German. But yeah, trying to get a beer on night, crikey, forget it.
Yes. Yes, I recognise all of those things. And yeah, I think they were all prize-winning talks, weren't they? If I recall from the IRTF Open. So yeah, it's good that they provide a platform to
Never
the
dull.
yes.
Often young people with good ideas or interesting ideas, and yeah, they're never dull. And this time, again, quite a collegiate atmosphere. No one got there were no snarky comments, unlike some at the last meeting that we were in, which were probably unnecessarily hard on the presenters.
Yes. Okay, thanks for that, Tom. Let me just move on to Friday. And to be honest, I didn't really pull out anything of interest, well, anything noteworthy. Which then reminded me I hadn't been to any of the side meetings, so I didn't have anything to say about those. So let me just pause again and see if anyone had anything noteworthy from Friday, in which case feel free to just jump in if anything really stood out. And if not, no, well, then let me go back to my slides. I'm going to very briefly, just so we'll finish on time, just say
I think both you and I did miss the reception on Friday, so
yes.
neither of us could comment on the standard of any open bar that may have been present.
Oh, right. The closing reception
Yes.
was at the farewell reception. Yeah. Yes, it was a shame to miss that this time around, but there you are.
Sorry, I know that is an important data point for people who might be going next time, but we can't comment.
Yes, might be easier in San Francisco, perhaps. Okay, right. Let me just quickly whiz through these. I think most of you are on my sort of weekly headlines mailing list. If you're not want to be, drop me a message. I will add you. But of the many things that were there, PQC migration. There's a reminder, interesting article from Sandra Murphy of Akamai that a US executive order requires, and I quote, all high-value assets and high-impact systems to use post-quantum cryptography for key establishment by December 31st, 2030, and for digital signatures by December 31st, 2031. And that obviously has applicability to DNSSEC, amongst other things. And from what I've read, at least some people are suggesting that might actually be a bit over optimistic on when you need it by. And in fact, 2029 might be the date when PQC becomes necessary because of development of quantum cryptography. Well, quantum computing, sorry, by capability by then.
But that reminds me, Andrew.
Yes.
Just on that subject, were you in the Friday meeting where people were talking about migrating certificates to quantum computing proof stuff?
Was that the DNS? Was that DNS Ops? Sorry, or something else?
Something else, I think, and you remember it if it was the turducken certificate was the proposed solution.
Right. Okay, so I don't think I was in that one.
I shall attempt to dig out the link to it, but it was incredibly interesting in ways to prove the certificate system against quantum computing.
Yeah.
And how we might translate that. I'll see if I can dig out a link in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Sorry, you just triggered a latent memory in there.
Yeah, but I think key point is if you're selling into, I presume, federal government, as it's an executive order, then you have to have that in place by either end of December 2030 or 31, depending on what it is. But in reality, you may need it before then. If some of the forecasts, I think IBM and Cloudflare sort of separately suggested 2029 might be the critical date. So other interesting stuff around the volume of domains in place now. It's over 400 million for the first time now, grown just over 8% in the last 12 months. And of course, we've got the ICANN's new round of GTOD applications closing middle of September of August. So that percentage that growth may kick up as ICANN works through those applications. Christian Dawson looking at research from Interisle, which concluded that at least 20% of domain registrations last year were made by bad actors. And he sort of talked through what matters in that. I won't try and summarize it. You can see it on the slide or in the stuff I sent to you earlier today. I think it was an interesting discussion. And in my opinion, it just reinforces the point we must get proper know your customer processes in place. Write Labs competition. If you want free tickets to the next Write meeting, write an article, win a prize, and the prize could be free tickets and or free travel to the thing. So that's worth doing. And the last one I was going to go to, weirdly my mouse has just disappeared, which is unhelpful. Bear with me. Right, I use the keyboard. Was Bind. Oh, my machine's about to restart in 5 minutes. Right, I'll make this quick. Bind sort of put out some 9 updates from sort of vulnerabilities they got apparently from AI, and it really sort of touched on the volume of vulnerabilities that have been identified and notified, and whether it's practical for open source providers in particular to stay on top of that. On the same day that Bind 9.20.26 was released, you'll see Unbound and Power DNS both released updates as well. So it's an issue that the industry needs to grapple with. It's not obvious what the solution is, but I can't see the volume of notifications going down. Right. Other things. Oh yeah, last one on this. Just a reminder that on day 3 of OARC 47 is going to be a member-led session day. So if you've got ideas for topics for that day, please submit them by the 24th of August. And that will be in addition to days 1 and 2, which are being developed by the program committee. So this will be, if you like, done separately to that. I think the idea is 4 blocks of sessions, discussions, panels, whatever. See what goes forward, and that sort of takes place on the 11th of November in Vancouver, with the 2 preceding days being, if you like, the regular OARC session. Loads of other things of interest. I won't have time to go through these because we're run over time, and also my machine's going to reboot in 3 minutes, which is bad. I don't know why that is, but anyway, so read through those at your leisure. I'll share the slides afterwards, but all of these are also on the weekly headlines list. A reminder, end of this month, the sort of Write 93 early bird rate finishes. So if you are planning to go to Sophia, register by the 31st, otherwise it gets a bit more expensive. If you're going to Osnog, the deadline for Lightning Talks is also the 31st. And also, if you want to go to the Internet Governance Forum in Nairobi in December, the call for session proposals deadline is also the 31st. So a whole series of things there, loads of stuff after that. The other one I'll remind you of, the Nominate DNS Fund, the deadline is the 17th of August. You'll recall from Carl's presentation a couple of weeks back that it's a fairly light touch application process with potentially funding of up to, I think it's 15k for an individual. Was it 100k? I wouldn't swear to that. It was more than that for an organization, for either a one-off sum or for 3 equal sums on each of 3 years, or as many as 3 years. So potentially quite significant sums of money for open source DNS relevant things. And then loads of things happening, still forthcoming events, but not really any I'm aware of in August. So things kick off again in September with Osnog, APNIC, ITU Study Group 17, Content Week, etc., etc. And then finally, I haven't firmed up a content, a theme for next week. I'll let you know that at some point during the week. The week after, Jim Mosley, I think Adrian Farrell and others will be talking about agentic AI naming and discovery. And then finally, let me stop talking there. I don't know if I can get rid of this screen. Oh, my cursor is working again. Sorry, and say any other business from anyone. Sorry, that was a bit of a run through, but I wanted to wrap up on time. And also, as I say, my machine's about to restart. No, I'm not seeing anyone jumping in which case, apologies for the rapid bit at the end, but hopefully that was a useful summary. We'll signpost some things, some recordings and session details that would be worth your while referring to if you weren't able to attend, or even if you were from the week. So have a fantastic week, everyone, and catch up next Monday, but have a great week in the meantime. Bye all.